All right, I'm live. I'm wondering if anyone's watching here, so I'm not sure how to read the chat. Anyhow, so I just wanted to go over the new NAR settlement. What we've got is some new rules that came down from the settlement with NAR, National Association of Realtors, that kind of changed the way we do business. A lot has changed, and then nothing has changed at the same time. People still need to buy and sell. The way we pay the agents is getting shuffled around, and that's what's causing all the confusion. Some are arguing that that's going to bring commission prices down. Some people think that now buying a house is going to be free. I'm kind of in the camp that I think the fees are going to go up. We've made the transaction a lot more complicated for the consumer and a lot more complicated for the people doing the transactions. And that added friction, I think, is going to add costs at some level. I don't know where those costs are going to come out at, if that's going to end up on the seller side of the commission or the buyer side of the commission. But that's all speculation at this point. So we're about a week into this. I think last Saturday was when it was first required to be implemented in my market, the 17th. Before a buyer can view a property, like a showing, there needs to be a touring agreement signed by the agent. The buyer has to sign that touring agreement. If that buyer does not sign the touring agreement, there's like a $2,000 fine or something crazy by our local board if that's not signed. And so in that touring agreement, it just basically discloses to the buyer how the agent gets paid, because those fees are no longer published in the MLS. That's the other part of the requirement on the NAR settlement, is the MLS was created to have different companies all agree and work together to show each other's listings. And if one person from a different broker had a buyer for another broker's house, that was the contract that allowed that other broker to pay that agent compensation. So that allowed that buyers to view all the properties in that market rather than just what was on that one company's website, or at the time listing inventory. And then the seller's agent or the seller's broker opened it up to all the buyers in the market. So it worked extremely well for the consumers and extremely well for the businesses, the brokers. And yeah, it just, the buyers and sellers won big time on that. Now the Department of Justice stepped in and interfered and said, okay, you cannot agree to pay the other broker. So we're going to make sure that on the MLS, you do not offer that compensation. And that's the only reason the MLS existed, was to pay that compensation. So right now we're going to presume that the MLS stays intact, even though the reason for it has gone away. And that now what the DOJ wants is the buyer to be responsible for negotiating and paying for their own agent's fees. So the Department of Justice was concerned that the buyer never knew how much their agent was getting paid. It was just a mystery. And I can understand that there's some concern on that, because that was paid for by the seller's agent, and the seller negotiated that commission. Say it was 5, 6, 7, 8%, whatever it was. And then they would agree to what they wanted to pay the buyer's agents. The buyer's agent never negotiated their own commission. It was just whatever the seller's agent and the seller was offering. So now that fee is going to be negotiated between the agent and the buyer. So there's a possibility that fee actually goes up, especially in like a seller's market. When you're writing 20, 30 offers, showing 100 houses, and just, there's a lot of time and, and energy that goes into that. So we'll see how that all shakes down. But I just wanted to go over our board's touring agreement and kind of read through that. I'm going to add this. This is what our touring agreement looks like locally. So if you call up an agent, you go find the house online on Zillow or wherever, and you say, I want to see this house. And Zillow does not set you up with the listing agent. Zillow's in the business of selling leads to other agents. So they'll connect you with another agent in the marketplace and then try to collect a fee for that referral. And so let's say you get someone from XYZ brokerage that goes and shows ABC. They're going to have this buyer touring agreement signed. So no longer are the days where you just go out there, call up an agent, and go look at a property. So we're going to run through that scenario. Then we'll talk about the scenario of contacting the seller's agent directly. So you contact Zillow and they set you up with another agent or any agent, maybe an agent you've worked with in the past. Before that agent can show you the property, they're going to need a buyer touring agreement signed. This is the one created by my local board of realtors through the MLS. Different brokerages will have their own. My brokerage has a very simple one right now because we're all learning how this is going to operate. So I haven't really gone through this one, so I'm kind of going through this live. So you're going to end up signing some sort of form giving you permission to tour the property, and that's basically going to explain how the agent is not representing you and basically how the agent's going to get paid. So it's more disclosure is what it is. You're not really in a contract here, kind of and kind of not, and I'll get into that. So the buyer touring agreement is made between buyer and broker as identified in the signature block. Brokerage compensation and commissions are not set by law and are fully negotiable. They always have been. Okay, so purposes and services. Under this agreement, broker will assist buyer in locating a property to purchase only by arranging appointments and conducting tours of available properties with buyer. The services. Buyer gives broker the non-exclusive right to provide these services. If buyer wishes to submit an offer on the property toured under this agreement property or to engage in broker of other brokerage services, the parties may enter into a separate agreement addressing those other services and compensation due to broker for them, if any. Buyer has bona fide interest in the purchase of real estate. Buyer will provide broker with all information necessary to facilitate the services. Buyer will pay broker the compensation in Section 3, if any. That's what I'm going to talk about later when we get to Section 3. So buyer may or may not tour with broker listings for which broker is the seller's broker. So if the seller is representing the seller, they're a seller's broker, as that term is defined by Minnesota law. Listings where broker has a contract with the seller to represent the seller. If may is checked, buyer will be unrepresented buyer on the property where broker is a seller's broker, and buyer should not share confidential information with the broker. Okay, so now you're representing yourself under this touring agreement. Seller's broker are required to disclose their sellers any information relevant to the sale of their listings. On any property where broker is not a seller's broker, broker will work as a facilitator, as that term is defined in Minnesota law. So a facilitator is, you have some fiduciary responsibilities. You're going to facilitate the transaction, but you're not being represented. You're representing yourself at this point. So buyer and broker each acknowledge that broker does not represent buyer as buyer's agent, in bold. Broker does not owe buyer any duties other than as specified to this agreement and as required by Minnesota law. Broker will use commercially reasonable efforts to provide services to buyer. Broker may represent or work with other potential buyers for the same or similar properties. Broker will deal honestly with all parties and in compliance with all laws and regulations. And then the term is going to be the dates. So you could set this for a year, you could set this for a month, you could set it for a day, whatever, you could even go specifically to that property. And then this agreement can or cannot be canceled by either party upon written notice. So there's not a lot of, excuse me, I didn't mean to cough into the microphone. It's not a very binding agreement because both parties can cancel upon written notice. Now, here's where it gets interesting. And this is where the business may change drastically. And this is kind of where I'm thinking that commissions may go up over time. So broker's compensation. So buyer must pay broker the total compensation set out below when due unless buyer makes an offer to purchase a property for which broker is a seller's broker. Total compensation will be kept by broker whether or not buyer purchases a property. Buyer may direct broker to obtain as much as possible of the total compensation from the listing broker or seller, but buyer remains liable for the balance. Broker may not, however, receive compensation from any source for the services to buyer that exceed the total compensation. Total compensation is a sum of the following. Check all that apply. Okay, so I think what we're going to see is no fee right out of the gate. I think everyone, the consumers and the agents, all kind of expect this to operate as it normally has. The sellers are going to be paying a commission out to both brokers, the buyer and seller broker. There will be probably some more disclosures so that the buyer understands how much their agent's getting paid. But otherwise, I think everyone's anticipating things are going to operate normally. However, the Department of Justice has made it clear that they do not want broker-to-broker compensation. So this ordeal is long from over. At some point, there's probably going to be more legal action. And then if that happens, then I think we're going to see more and more of this get pushed onto the buyer, where the seller is going to pay their commission, and then the buyer is going to be responsible for paying their commission to their agent. So the other option for a showing is a flat fee. Buyer shall pay a flat fee of, let's say, $100 due upon signing of this agreement within whatever 2 days after invoice from broker, or per tour fee of, say, $100 for each tour of any property. Hourly fee, may pay an hourly fee of, let's say, $250 for each hour the broker spends on providing services hereunder, due within X amount of days from invoice, or other fee. And then that other fee, could potentially be a percentage too. So this is what the argument was, is they being the attorneys on that lawsuit, and then the Department of Justice, they want to break that seller paying the buyer's commission. And then their argument was, we're going to reduce commissions. The 6% commission is going to go away. It never was always 6. It was, 4 to 8%, 4 to 10%. So they'll reduce the average commission and move that over to the buy side, but nothing has gotten simpler. So the same amount of work is going into it. In fact, it's making it more complicated for everyone involved. So when you add that much more friction, I just see the cost of doing business going up. The liability, I think, has increased substantially. So I just see either fees, like these fees, showing fees, all getting stacked in there, where the actual transaction costs start to go up. Now, whether or not it's called commission or not, or whether it's a percentage, but it's going to be the cost of doing the transactions going up. And I'm thoroughly convinced that's going to happen. Broker as seller's broker. If broker is a seller's broker for a property that buyer purchases, buyer will pay no total compensation to broker for the services. Broker services are not free, but broker's compensation will come from the seller of the property for services the broker has rendered to the seller, which includes finding a buyer for the property. Okay, so now the broker representing the seller, if the buyer buys directly from that seller's broker, they're going to have to charge more than cutting that commission in half, because they're taking both sides of the transaction. So you're not, let's just, for easy math, we're going to do the 6%. And let's say half of that goes to the seller's agent, half goes to the buyer's agent. You're still going to be at a 6% commission if that buyer goes directly to the seller's broker without representation. Now, it's possible that it's going to be a simple transaction and that broker may say, okay, we might reduce it, but they're not likely to reduce it to 3%. They may reduce it to 5%. They may reduce it to 4.5%, whatever they end up negotiating, depending on how complex that deal is. But there's too much liability involved in the transactions, too much work that goes into it, so that fee does not get cut in half. So if a buyer, if you're looking to go represent yourself and try to save 3% off the sales price, you could always have done that. You could always negotiate whatever you want for the price, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's coming off the seller's broker side, right? There's still expenses, there's still transaction fees. And just because you make that offer does not mean that that comes off, right? That there's still that expense there. Okay, so fair housing, broker services fees, or broker services are provided without regard to race, color, creed, color, sex, national origin, sexual, marital status, in regard to public assistance, disability, familial status, gender identity, or sexual orientation. Local ordinance may provide for additional protected classes. So it's legally binding. Buyer should seek legal advice if buyer has questions about these terms. And then the broker will print the name, licensee, agent, and then buyer's printed name, and then buyer's signature. Okay, so that's what we got to look forward to. So now I want to see if I can find if there's anyone in chat. And I'm not sure how to do that. All right. Live stream. It doesn't look like I have anyone on here that I can see. So that's what we're going to be dealing with as far as what the buyer has to sign when they go to look at a property. They're going to go in underrepresented. There's still transaction fees. There's still costs associated with that showing. Right out of the gate, we've had experience where buyers are not having any pushback to signing these. People still want to buy and sell a house. Most of the customers out there, sellers and buyers, think this is the stupidest thing they've ever seen. They're not very happy with it, but these are the new rules everyone's got to play by. The intent on this is trying to make it more consumer friendly. I think it's had the exact opposite impact of that. But I believe that is really what pushed the settlement and the lawsuit, and then the Department of Justice. Is the intent is trying to make it more consumer friendly and more transparent. I could sit here for hours and argue that it's doing just the opposite, and then someone else may argue just the exact opposite of me. So that's what all the noise has been, is mainly within the industry. I think what we're finding is the consumer wants the easy button. They want to buy and sell property. They don't want to deal with all the complications and the headaches when we keep throwing more and more paperwork at them. The paperwork does not come from the brokers. It comes from the legal system. And we just have to play by these rules. So if you are looking to buy a house and this paperwork's thrown out in front of you, I hope you have a better understanding on why it's being presented to you. It's just the way we have to do business now. And the intent is to be more transparent, even though you may think it's just the opposite and add complications, which I agree with you, but those are the rules. So that's what I got to share. Good news is, I think a lot of brokers are doing their own agreement, showing agreement. And right now, those are much more plain language and a little more clear, and a little easier to understand what you're signing rather than all that kind of the legalese on that. But if things get more complicated and convoluted, we'll probably end up with more like what you see here. It's not a bad agreement. You know what you're getting into, but hopefully you understand it better. If you got questions, reach out. And that's all I got. So just thought I'd share that this afternoon, and I will talk to you later. Thanks.